previous video, we already completed scapula and humerus. If you didn't watch those videos, please go back and revise that before coming to this video to clearly appreciate the content and understand the things what we are discussing now. Now let us directly come to the topic. In this video, we will be discussing regarding the radius bone that is present along with the ulna in the region called as forearm. The forearm region is made up of two bones. The first one is the radius and another one is ulna. Now let us look at this image. The most practical way to approach this aspect of anatomy is through images. So please be careful while looking at these images. Let us look at the radius bone. This is the radius and behind that this is the ulna. These two bones make up the forearm region. And above the, now today only we will discuss regarding the radius bone. In the next upcoming video we will discuss thoroughly regarding the ulna bone. The radius is long bone which contain a shaft and two extremities. To be called as a long bone to any bone, a bone must has a shaft and two extremities. And the radius forms the two joints above with the distal extremity of the humerus, and this joint is called as the elbow joint. Below with that of the proximal row of carpal and the distal extremity of the radius and ulna combinedly form a joint called as the carpal joint. And this radius placed as obliquely downward between the above elbow joint and below the carpal joint. Now let us come to the shaft. Radius is the larger and shorter of the two bones of the forearm. Radius is larger bone as compared to the ulna, but it is shorter. And it is a long bone which placed obliquely downward between the above elbow joint and below the carpal joint. And it consists of a shaft and two extremities. Now let us come to the shaft. Shaft is flattened from before backward, which means from anterior to posterior it is flattened. It has two surfaces and two borders. And those surfaces are the dorsal surface is also called as anterior surface, and the ulnar surface it is also called as the posterior surface. Dorsal surface is convex along its length and it is smooth and which is covered by the extensors. And the ulnar surface is concave. Ulnar surface is concave along its length and it presents along its the lateral border a narrow rough area. Let us consider this as the ulnar surface or the posterior surface of the radius along the lateral border. If we consider this as the lateral aspect and this as the medial aspect and this as the ulnar surface or the posterior surface of the radius, and along the lateral side of the ulnar aspect of the radius there is a rough area which is provided for the attachment of the ulna bone. And in the two regions, in the two sides along this radius bone, there is a smooth areas which create arches, and those two arches are called as the radio-ulnar arches. These arches are nothing but foramen or the gaps between the radius and ulna. And the above one is called as the proximal interosseous space and the below one is called as the distal interosseous space. To make clear that this is the posterior aspect and this is the lateral and the medial aspect. Here there is the ulna bone and above there is a gap between the ulna and radius bone, and below is also there is a gap between the radius and ulna bone, and this interosseous space is called as the proximal interosseous space and this one is called as the distal interosseous space or called as radio-ulnar arches. This is about the ulnar surface. And one more point in the ulnar aspect is called as that is the radio-ulnar groove. In the lateral aspect of this radius and ulna there is a groove and which is provided for the passage of the interosseous vessels. The blood vessels which are arising from the interosseous spaces will run in the groove which is provided by the radio-ulnar groove. Now let us come to the medial and lateral border. It has two surfaces and two borders. Just now we discussed the ulnar surface. Now it's time to discuss about the medial border. Medial border is for the most part of the subcutaneous tissues and it has a rough area for the brachialis muscle. The insertion of brachialis muscle is provided by the medial border of the rough area of the radius. And brachialis muscle is present in the musculospiral groove of the humerus. Now let us come to the lateral border. Lateral border is rounded in its proximal third. It is wide and flat below and it has provided with the radio-ulnar groove. It is the same groove we are just now we have discussed in the ulnar aspect of the radius, and that groove is provided passage for the interosseous vessels. This border also gives attachment to the lateral digital extensors and the extensor carpi obliquus. These are the two extensors among the 5 extensors. To this point of time, you just remember that the extensors are present on the anterolateral aspect of the radius and ulna, and the flexors are present on the posterior ulnar aspect, medial and ulnar aspect of the radius and ulna. And in detail of these extensor and flexors, we will be studying in the myology section of the anatomy. Now let us come to the proximal extremity. Proximal extremity of the radius is an articular area. To be called any bone part as the articular area, so it must make a joint with the another bone. So to make any joint, there must be two facets, and the facets are created by a groove called as sagittal groove. And as we all studied that the humerus in the distal extremity is provided with two condyles, the middle condyle and the lateral condyle. Medial condyle is larger as compared to the lateral condyle. To accommodate that larger medial condyle, there must be a facet with that much amount of larger medial facets. So in the uh, proximal extremity, here is a groove is called as sagittal groove, which divides the proximal extremity into two facets, the medial one and lateral one. Medial one is larger as compared to the lateral one because to accommodate large condyle of the humerus bone, and it articulates with the distal extremity of the humerus, obviously, and it's surrounded by a rim which carries a coronoid process about the middle of the anterior surface. Please concentrate here. This is the proximal extremity, and at the middle of this there is a process, and that process we call it as the coronoid process. The coronoid process is present on the radius bone. I repeat, the coronoid process is present in the middle part of the anterior surface of the radius bone. This is the anterior surface and this one is the posterior surface. And this is the sagittal groove, this is the lateral facet and this is the middle facet, and this one is the coronoid process. This coronoid process is received into coronoid fossa. Now let us understand the coronoid fossa is present in the humerus, that is in the anterior aspect of the distal part of the humerus. During the extreme flexion of the elbow joint, that is nothing but during the extreme bending of that elbow, during that process, the coronoid process of that radius bone will be accommodating into the coronoid fossa of the humerus bone. This is about the second point. Now let us come to the next, that is posteriorly just below the articular surface. This is about the anterior aspect. In the anterior aspect, we have the coronoid process. This coronoid process will accommodate in the coronoid fossa of the humerus during the extreme flexion of the elbow. And in the posterior surface, posteriorly just below the articular surface, there are two facets for the articulation with the like facets of the ulna. This is nothing but posterior surface is provided with the facets for the attachment of the ulna. To be specifically, posterior surface with the lateral aspect. The lateral aspect of the posterior surface has the facets for the attachment of the ulna. And between these and the proximal interosseous space, there is a quadrilateral rough area, which mean, let us consider this as the posterior aspect or the, the ulnar side of the radius, and behind this there is the ulna. There is the rough surface at the lateral side of the radius to attachment of the ulna, and there is a rough quadrilateral area which is present between the facets for the attachment of the ulna and between the interosseous space, that is the proximal interosseous space, and between the facets for the attachment of the ulna at the posterior part of the anterior extremity. The area which is between the proximal interosseous space and the facets which are present at the proximal extremity of the posterior surface of the radius, and such area is a quadrilateral area. It is a rough and to which the ulna is attached. And after this, the proximal interosseous space, and there is behind that there is the distal interosseous space. This is about the posterior aspect of the anterior extremity or the proximal extremity. And in the middle aspect of the anterior extremity, in the middle aspect of the anterior face presents a radial tuberosity to which the biceps brachii is inserted. The biceps brachii originated from the musculospiral groove, which is inserted at the radial tuberosity, which is present on the middle aspect of the anterior face. And this is the point we have to keep in our mind. And the lateral tuberosity is more prominent, and which gives the attachment to the lateral extensors of the digits. This is about the proximal extremity. And now let us come to the distal extremity. Distal extremity is wide. It is wide as compared to the anterior extremity, and it presents three oblique facets. And these facets for the carpal bones, such as the radial, intermediate, and ulnar. There are four carpal bones at the proximal row. This is the proximal row, and beneath this there is the distal row. And the proximal row contains four carpal bones. From medial to lateral, these are, the first one is the radial, then the intermediate, and then ulnar. And behind this there is another carpal bone, that is the accessory bone. And this is about the proximal row. When it comes to the distal row, in the distal row there is two bones, and those are called as second and third fused. Second and third fused, and another one is the fourth. Totally there are six carpal bones, We will be studying these bones in the next upcoming video. Don't worry about that. And to this point, just remember that in the distal extremity of the radius, there are three oblique facets. These facets for the attachment of the carpal bones from middle aspect to the lateral aspect. Sequentially, those are the radial, intermediate, and ulnar carpals from within and within towards the outward. The facets for the ulnar carpal is pretty furnished by the ulna, which means that the ulnar carpal is accommodated by the ulna. On the medial and lateral aspect of the distal extremity, there are rough elevations for the collateral ligaments of the carpus. This is about the radius bone of the ox. To summarize this in very short, this is a long bone which has a shaft and two extremities, which is present between the elbow above joint and below one, that is carpal joint. It consists one shaft and two extremities. The shaft has two surfaces, dorsal and ulnar surface. Dorsal surface is convex and ulnar surface is concave. It is also called as the posterior surface. The lateral side of the posterior surface has a rough area for the attachment of the ulna, and that rough area is interrupted by the two smooth areas, thereby creating two spaces, and those spaces are called as the interosseous space. And those are, the above one is called as the proximal interosseous space and the below one is called as the distal interosseous space. Those interosseous space are also called as the radio-ulnar arches. And in the lateral aspect of the ulnar surface, there is also a groove that is called as the radio-ulnar groove. A groove between the radius and ulna is meant for the passage of the interosseous vessels. There are some blood vessels which are running from the interosseous spaces. Those are nothing but the proximal interosseous spaces and distal interosseous spaces. Those vessels will be passed into these groove, which is nothing but the radio-ulnar groove. And when it comes to the middle border, it has rough area for the attachment of the brachialis, the muscle which is present in the musculospiral groove that insert at the rough area of the middle border of the radius bone. And in the lateral border, the same, that is radial groove will be there, and which provide for the passage of the interosseous vessels, and it gives the attachment for the extensors. And in the proximal extremity, it is an articular area which is divided by the sagittal groove into two divisions. And by creating two facets, the medial and the lateral facet, middle will be the larger to accommodate the larger size of the condyle, and it has the ring in the middle of the anterior surface of the proximal extremity of the radius. There is a process, and that is called the coronoid process, and that process will be received into the coronoid fossa of the humerus during the extreme flexion of the elbow. And posterior side of the anterior extremity, there is just below, there is an articular area or two facets for the attachment of the ulna, and from that facets to the first interosseous space, that is nothing but the proximal interosseous space, there is an quadrilateral area where the ulna is attached. The anterior part of the ulna is attached to the quadrilateral area. That quadrilateral area is created between the facets, the attachment for the posterior surface of the anterior extremity of the radius and between the first proximal interosseous space. And in the middle aspect of the anterior face, it provides radial tuberosity. It is very important from the examination point of view. Radial tuberosity is present in the middle aspect, into which the bicep brachia will be inserted, and the lateral tuberosity is more prominent, and which gives attachment to the lateral extensors of the digit. And in the distal extremity, it is wide. It has three oblique facets for the attachment of the radial, intermediate, and ulnar carpals. Now, after finishing the radius of the ox, now we will compare the other species bones with that of ox radius. In the sheep and goat, it is relatively larger and more curved. Dorsal surface is regularly rounded. In case of horse, there are 3 to 4 points which will be different, which we can differentiate it from the ox bone. The lateral border presents only one smooth area to form the proximal radio-ulnar arch. This is what makes the radius of the horse bit different from the radius of the ox. In the radius of ox, there are two interosseous spaces, namely the proximal interosseous spaces and distal interosseous spaces. But the ulnar bone of the horse is restricted towards the middle of the radius bone. It will not extend up to the radius, so it will not create any chance to make the distal interosseous space. So only the proximal interosseous space is seen in the horse, and the radial tuberosity is more prominent in the horse. The facets which are present at the distal extremity, and these are less oblique in the horse, whereas in the ox, those three facets in the distal extremity mean for the accommodation of that radial, intermediate, and ulnar carpal. Those are more oblique in nature as compared to the horse. This is about the horse. And in case of pig, it is short, thick, and curved posteriorly. And dog also has some distinguishable characters of the radius, and those are both the ulna and radius are relatively long bone, and it articulate with each other at their extremities. This is the point. If you consider this as the radius, and here this is as the ulna, by creating a narrow, a long interosseous space, which permit a certain degree of movement. This is a major difference in the dog, that those two bones, radius and ulna, are articulate with each other at their extremities, so creating a narrow interosseous space throughout their length. But this will be not seen in case of ox. In case of ox, we will see there is ulna will be attached to the lateral aspect of the ulnar surface by creating two interosseous spaces, proximal and distal, namely. But in case of horse, we will only see the first proximal interosseous space, because the ulna will not run along the it will not reach the end of the radius, so there is no scope of formation of the distal interossei space. And one more important point, that the styloid process is present in the dog. This styloid process is nothing but a bony prominence as the distal extremity is wide and its middle border projects. Distal extremities and its middle border projects are downward, forming a styloid process. Like this, there is a styloid process of the radius. This is a prominent feature in case of dog. You have to remember this styloid process and narrow interossei space throughout the length. These 2 points are distinguishable in the dog. This is about the radius of ox. In next video, we will be discussing the ulnar bone of the ox. Thank you.